A scientist walks into the forum holding a thick stack of documents. His sharp eyes scan the room. He taps the microphone. His deep voice rings out. We live in a scientific age where everything must be tested experimentally. If it can't be measured, if it can't be repeated, it's just superstition. A round of applause from the positivists who believe that science is the only way to truth on the other side. A Buddhist smiles quietly. He has no documents nor complicated diagrams, just a simple question. If someone has never tasted salt, can you use mathematics to explain the taste of salt? The room goes silent. The scientist frowns and replies, we can analyze the chemical composition of salt, measure its effect on taste buds, explain the neural mechanism when the mesh is exposed to sodium chloride. The Buddhist nods. But will that help the person really know what salt tastes like? There is no absolute answer to that question, and that is the crux of the debate between empirical science and atheistic. Buddhism, one side, asserts that only what can be measured is credible, that everything that is beyond experimentation is a myth. The other side does not deny science, but raises another question: is reality limited to what we can measure? If science cannot prove consciousness, does that mean consciousness does not exist? If experiences like enlightenment, meditation, or reincarnation cannot be put into a laboratory, does that mean they are just illusions? But this is not just a debate between theory and reality, between faith and science. It is a question of how people perceive the world. If Buddhism is atheistic, then is it synonymous with positivism? And if science rejects the divine, is it an alternative to Buddhism, or are they both looking at the same reality but from two different angles? Positivism is not a new theory. It has been around since the 19th century, when Auguste Comte declared that only what can be observed, measured, and verified has value. Everything that is beyond the scope of scientific research is considered meaningless and not worth discussing. Since then, positivism has become the foundation of modern science, bringing humanity from the darkness of religious dogma to the era of reason and experimentation. But there is a problem when science develops too quickly. Is it unintentionally becoming a new form of religion? The 21st century is the age of data, numbers, and statistical models. We believe in scientists the way ancient people believed in gods when a study is published that a food can cause cancer. The whole world rushes to change its diet when a new theory is proven. Millions of people are willing to accept it without any self-verification. From biophysics to neuroscience, modern science seems to be able to explain everything from the origin of the universe to the workings of the human brain. While rejecting traditional religious systems, science is slowly becoming a form of dogma that few dare to question. Modern positivism relies on repetition and measurement. An experiment that cannot be repeated many times under the same conditions cannot be considered true. So can everything in life be repeated? Can every phenomenon in the universe be put under a microscope? Can a person prove the feeling of suffering or happiness with a mathematical equation? If a person reaches a state of enlightenment, is there any way to measure or recreate that experience in a laboratory? The confidence of science today may lead many to think that humanity is gradually approaching an absolute understanding of the universe. But if we look back at history, we will see that what was once considered scientific truth in the past is now just a mistake. Before Einstein appeared, Newton was the absolute truth before quantum theory was born. Classical mechanics was once considered perfect. So what we believe to be science today is really the absolute truth, or just a stage in the evolution of consciousness. While Buddhism does not have a creator, there is no supreme God who decides human destiny. There is no eternal heaven or eternal hell of punishment. But does that make Buddhism identical with positivism? It is not that simple. If positivism only acknowledges what can be measured, then Buddhism perceives the world in a different way, not only based on what can be seen with the eyes or touched with the hands, but also on what can be directly experienced with the mind. Right from the time of Buddha, he never asked his followers to believe in anything blindly. When a group of people came to ask Buddha who was telling the truth among the many sects that were arguing, he never told them to believe in him, but only said, "Do not believe anything. Just because it is tradition, because it is dogma, or because it is the teaching of a master, experience it yourself, verify it yourself." This is not the approach of a religion based on faith, but the method of a person who seeks the truth in an experimental way. But Buddhist experimentation does not take place in a laboratory. It takes place right inside the human mind. If a scientist wants to understand the universe, he will study subatomic particles, physical laws, chemical reactions. But if a person to understand one's own nature, one must go into the inner world to explore the workings of thoughts, emotions, and the impermanence of consciousness itself. This is why Buddhism emphasizes meditation not as a form of belief, but as a tool to observe reality at the deepest level. When a person meditates, they are not simply sitting still. They are actually experimenting with their own mind. And this is where positivism cannot reach. Modern science can measure brain waves. It can observe biochemical changes in the body when a person meditates, but it cannot measure the state of bliss of a person who has reached enlightenment. It can study how people process emotions, but it cannot directly experience liberation from suffering. If science only believes in what can be measured, then it may be missing the most important part of reality, the part that only we ourselves can experience for ourselves. Buddhism does not require people to believe in a God, but it is not as extreme as positivism, which rejects everything, all that cannot be measured. Buddhism does not deny science, but it sets an important limit. Science can study the physical world, but it cannot replace the personal experience of oneself. A scientist can write hundreds of research papers on happiness, but only a person who actually lives in that state can understand what it is. A person can argue about selflessness, but only when they reach that state will they really know if it is real or not. So is Buddhism a science? It is not a science in the empirical sense, because it is not limited to what can be measured. But it is an empirical method in a deeper sense, a science of the mind where everyone is a researcher and their own mind is the laboratory. And if science seeks truth through a microscope, through a nuclear reactor, Buddhism seeks truth in the silence of the mind. One side studies the external world. One side explores the internal world. Can both be heading towards the same truth or from two different paths? If Buddhism has no faith in a creator God, then should it be grouped with positivism or not? This is the point of contention between the two schools. A positivist scientist would argue that if it cannot be measured empirically, then all concepts like reincarnation, karma, or enlightenment are just illusions. There is no way to prove that a person can be reborn. There is no expectation to confirm that actions in this life will create consequences in the next life if science has not proven it. then does that mean those things do not exist? But a Buddhist would argue that science cannot measure everything because science is just a tool to understand the physical world. Let's take a simple example before the telescope. People could not see distant galaxies before the MRI technology. We could not see how the human brain works when thinking if science could not measure it. Before that does not mean it did not exist. It just means we did not have the right tools to explore it. One of the biggest problems with empirical science is that it only accepts what can be repeated under controlled conditions. But what if there are experiences that only happen once or can only be felt but not measured if a meditator reaches enlightenment? Can they reproduce the experience in a lab? If a person has memories of a past life, how can that be scientifically verified? Can scientists continue to argue if it can't be measured? How can one tell truth from illusion? If a person says they are enlightened, how do you know it is truth and not illusion? Buddhism has the answer. If you want to know if water is hot or cold, you have to drink it yourself. If you want to know if meditation can change your perception, you have to practice it yourself. If you want to verify karma, you have to observe your own life. Buddhism doesn't force anyone to believe anything, but encourages them to experience it for themselves. But is that enough to convince a positivist who demands clear evidence? So what is the nature of reality? Science says that this universe is just matter, that consciousness is a product of the brain, that everything can be explained by physical laws. But Buddhism says that consciousness is not something that depends on matter, but consciousness itself is the basis of all experience. Matter may be real, but if there is no consciousness to perceive it, does it exist? This is like the famous philosophical question: if a tree sits in the forest with no one to hear it, does it really make a sound? At this point, it is no longer simply science versus religion, but two opposing views of reality. One side believes that the objective world is supreme, that truth lies in what can be measured and analyzed. The other side believes that perception is the core, that it is the mind that determines how we experience reality. If consciousness is something that cannot be measured but is the most important factor in perceiving the world, then is science missing the most important thing? Then if we see Buddhism as a mystical belief system, then it seems to go against empirical science. But if we see Buddhism as an empirical method to explore the nature of consciousness, then Buddhism is closer to science than any other religion may be. Positivism and atheistic Buddhism seem to be opposites. But if we look closely between these two systems of thought, there are surprising points of intersection. Both reject the existence of an omnipotent creator. Both rely on the principle of cause and effect to explain the world. Both encourage exploration rather than blind faith. We live in an age where both science and spirituality are making great strides. Modern science is increasingly interested in areas previously considered unscientific, such as the effects of meditation on the brain, the neural mechanisms of enlightenment, or the connection between consciousness and reality. Recent studies show that meditation not only changes the structure of the brain, but also has a direct impact on cognitive and emotional health. What was previously considered a personal experience can now be observed using advanced brain imaging technology. But although science can measure changes in brain activity when a person meditates, it still cannot explain the nature of that experience. And scientists cannot understand enlightenment only by observing the electrical signals in the brain. They have to meditate themselves to really understand what it means. At the same time, Buddhism is no longer a closed system as it was in the past. Today, many Zen monks and Buddhist scholars have collaborated with scientists to study the nature of consciousness, the workings of the mind, and the connection between meditation and human health. The Dalai Lama once said that if science one day proves that some aspect of Buddhist teachings is wrong, then Buddhism will have to adjust to the truth. This is a rare statement in the religious world because it shows that Buddhism is not stubborn in defending its views, but is willing to change to suit reality. But what can science learn from Buddhism? One of the most important things is the way to perceive consciousness. While Western science is still struggling with the question of whether consciousness is just a product of the brain or not, Buddhism has long viewed consciousness as an entity separate from matter, not limited by the workings of the body. This concept may sound unscientific at first, but if you consider studies on near-death experiences, phenomena such as past life memories, or cases where people can change their state of consciousness without any chemical effects, it seems that science still does not fully understand the nature of consciousness. Similarly, Buddhism also needs science. The most important thing is probably accuracy and empirical evidence. Although the teachings of Buddhism are very profound, but over time, many mythological and superstitious elements and folk beliefs have mixed into the original system, causing Buddhism in many places to no longer retain its original experimental spirit. Science can help filter out these unnecessary elements, helping Buddhism return to its original nature, a path of practice to reach wisdom and liberation, not a system of beliefs full of rituals and dogmas. From this perspective, science and Buddhism are not two opposing paths, but two different approaches to explore the same reality. One side uses reason and experiment to explore the outside world. One side uses meditation and contemplation to explore the inside world. And perhaps when science and Buddhism meet at the intersection point, humanity will move closer to the absolute truth, where the material world and the world of consciousness are no longer separated, where understanding does not only come from numbers and formulas, but also from the deepest experience of the human soul. We have gone through two seemingly opposite paths. Positivism, with the belief that only what can be measured and verified is trustworthy, and atheistic Buddhism, a path that does not rely on gods but opens the door to experiences beyond the ability of science to explain. But if we stop at the opposition, we may have missed the most important thing. Positivism has helped humanity escape the darkness of superstition, bringing great advances from medical technology to cosmology. But does it really answer all scientific questions? Science can explain the formation of the universe, but it cannot explain the question of why does it exist. Science can analyze the brain's working mechanism, but it cannot define exactly what consciousness is. While Buddhism does not accept the Almighty God, does not rely on blind faith, but proposes another experimental method, not through microscopes or particle accelerators, but through human consciousness itself. But if something can only be experienced by oneself without being measured or verified, does it have any value in the eyes of science? Perhaps the biggest mistake of humans is to try to impose an absolute limit on perception. If we only believe in science, we will ignore the depth of spiritual experiences. If we only believe in spirituality without empirical evidence, we easily fall into illusions. But if we know how to reconcile both, we can see a more complete picture of reality. Science helps humans understand the outside world, but Buddhism helps humans understand themselves. If both exist, then humans do not need to choose one of the two, but can use both to reach a more comprehensive understanding of the truth. Not in any doctrine, but in the very experience of everyone. We can argue forever about the consciousness of reality, about cause and effect or no self. But in the end, all words are just fingers pointing to the moon. The truth is not in the finger, but in the moon, something that everyone must contemplate for themselves. And perhaps when we are no longer bound by prejudices, no longer stubbornly adhere to a single path, then that is when we get closer to the ultimate truth. The thing that is always there does not belong to science nor to Buddhism, but belongs to the very nature of the universe and our consciousness. Thank you for accompanying Triat Tam. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and share the video with your loved ones. Triat Tam wishes you and your family good health.